Saturday is the centenary of the birth of Raymond Chandler. To mark the occasion, we've a rare chance now to hear him in conversation. 30 years ago, for the third program, Ian Fleming talked to him, though technically the recording hasn't lasted quite as well as we'd have hoped. Their conversation is introduced by Philip French.
Raymond Chandler was born in Chicago 100 years ago this week, though the city he'll always be associated with is Los Angeles. Back in the 1930s, he was one of a handful of writers who discovered and possessed L.A. for literary purposes. For many of us, Philip Marlowe will always go down its mean streets on his nightly errands, nightly as both nocturnal and chivalrous. But Chandler has a close association with another town, London. He was 7 when his parents' marriage broke up, and his Irish mother brought him here to live in genteel poverty. Like the creators of 2 other legendary serial characters, P.G. Wodehouse and C.S. Forrester, he attended Dulwich College, and on leaving school he made a false start as a literary journalist. But he didn't write well enough to make a name as a Georgian belles-lettres, or fast enough to become a successful hack. So at the age of 23, he returned to the States, settling in Los Angeles. He didn't take up writing again until he lost his job as an oil company executive in 1932, and began contributing hard-boiled stories to Black Mask magazine. But he never lost a rather dreamy love of England, and later attributed enormous importance to his classical education. "If I hadn't grown up on Latin and Greek," he wrote, "I doubt if I would have known so well how to draw the line between what I call a vernacular style and what I should call a faux-naïve style." And his biographer, Frank McShane, observed, "Unlike James, Conrad, or Joyce, who were in exile from worlds they detested, Chandler was in exile from a world he thought he loved. Instead of his admired England, he lived in a place where values seemed to shift with the tides." But Chandler had another reason for liking this country. To his annoyance, and he was a curmudgeonly character, what the Jacobeans would have called a malcontent, he was never taken seriously by American critics. They treated him merely as a writer of thrillers, not as a serious novelist. But in Britain it was otherwise, and I recall as a provincial sixth former back in 1951, listening on this channel, the third program, as it was then called, to a superb talk by the late H.A.L. Craig, colourfully entitled The Whiskey of Affliction, the Pistols and Pieties of Raymond Chandler. And in 1954, Chandler wrote a letter referring to a discussion of his novel, The Long Goodbye, on the Home Service program, The Critics, forerunner of Radio 3's Critics Forum. "I may be the best writer in this country," he said, "and with 2 exceptions, I think I am. But I'm still a mystery writer. For the first time in my life, I was reviewed as a novelist, capital N, in the London Sunday Times. And I was discussed on the BBC by as addled a group of so-called intellectuals, among whom Dilys Powell hardly got a word in, as ever had soup on their vests. But over here?" In 1952, Chandler made his first visit to London since before the Great War, and from 1954 onwards, after the death of his beloved wife, he was a frequent visitor. This once handsome man was, at the age of 66, wreck, depressed, alcoholic, written out. But he was lionized, and one of his new friends was Ian Fleming, whose Bond novels he'd been the first to appreciate. He reviewed Diamonds Are Forever in the Sunday Times, providing the kind of serious criticism he wanted for himself. And in 1956, in a letter to Fleming, Chandler said, "I did not think that I did quite do you justice in my review of your book, because anyone who writes as dashingly as you do ought, I think, to try for a little higher grade. I have just reread Casino Royale, and it seems to me that you have disimproved with each book." Fleming took this to heart, and his biographer, John Pearson, states that it was undoubtedly Raymond Chandler's interest which restored Fleming's enthusiasm for his writing and his hero. In July 1958, the poet and novelist George Macbeth, at that time a BBC Talks producer, brought Fleming and Chandler together on the air. The occasion was the publication of Chandler's last book, Playback, and the theme, British and American thrillers. Fleming and Macbeth picked up Chandler at 11 a.m. on the day of the recording and found his voice slurred with whiskey. But they got into Broadcasting House, and all apparently went reasonably well, though there was a certain amount of editing on the tape. I remember, Fleming later wrote, that in discussing Mickey Spillane and his retreat to expiate guilt into the arms of the Seventh-day Adventists, Chandler commented, "In a way, it's a shame that boy was the greatest aid to solitary sin," he used a blunt word for it, "in literature." Later, he apologized to the two pretty girls in the control room, and one of them said, "It's quite all right, Mr. Chandler. We hear much worse things than that." Their conversation was broadcast on the third program, and according to Frank McShane, it's the only recording in existence of Chandler's voice. 7 months later, on March the 23rd, 1959, Chandler died at his home in La Jolla, a small town north of San Diego. The day they taped their conversation was the last time the two writers met. And in this recording from the BBC archives, Ian Fleming speaks first.
Well, the first thing, I suppose, Ray, really is to define what we're supposed to be talking about. And I think the title of what we're supposed to be talking about is English and American thrillers. The first thing is, what is a thriller? And in my mind, of course, you don't write thrillers, and I do.
I do, too.
I don't call yours a novel.
Well, other people call them thrillers.
I know, I think it's wrong.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, you write novels of suspense like Simenon does and Eric Ambler does, perhaps, but in which violence is the background, just as love might be in the ordinary kind of straight novel.
Well, in America, a thriller of mystery story writers, we call them, is slightly below the salt.
Well, the thriller writing, yes, very below the salt, really.
You can write a very lousy, long, historical novel full of sex, and it can be a bestseller, and can be treated respectfully.
Yes.
But a very good thriller writer who writes far, far better is just gets a little paragraph, that's all.
I know, it's true.
Mostly.
Yeah.
There's no attempt to judge him as a writer.
Well, I don't know, I suppose, but you yourself are judged as a writer, and Dashiell Hammett was, I think.
Yes, but how long did it take me? You starved to death for 10 years before your publisher knows you're any good.
Well, yes, because your first story is now a very valuable first edition. Where do you get your material? I mean, these nearly always a Californian setting, isn't it? Has it ever not been a Californian setting?
Well, I lived many years in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles had never